the last westbound freight before the snows carried flour, coal, and 40-gallon barrels of kerosene stacked 3 high in the boxcars. By mid-December, drifts would bury the rails shoulder deep and hold them until April. What sat in the depot shed on the 15th of November was all the light most homesteads would see until spring. A typical claim family burned 3 gallons per month through the dark season, 5 hours per night at the table lamp, 2 more for kitchen and barn work. At 15 to 25 cents per gallon retail, that represented several days' wages over 4 months. But the real cost showed in what didn't happen when the barrel ran low. No evening mending, no ledger work after supper, children's reading cut short. The families that stretched 3 gallons into winter did so not by moral restraint, but by rearranging where the light actually went. 20 October, 1880. A homestead claim 20 miles from the nearest depot in eastern Dakota Territory. The kerosene can sat on the pantry floor, its tin sides dented from wagon transport, a white chalk line showing how fast the level had dropped the previous winter. Kerosene had become the standard rural light source across the United States by the 1870s and 80s, replacing whale oil and most candles in farmhouses, depots, and small-town shops. A typical household owned 1 or 2 decent flat-wick table lamps. Anything beyond that qualified as luxury. The numbers appeared in farm account books alongside flour, coal, and cloth. Kerosene prices had fallen from roughly 26 cents per gallon around 1870 to nearer 10 to 15 cents in bulk by the 1880s. But retail prices at country stores still held in the 15 to 25 cent band. Freight added weight, distance added cost. Burn rate determined monthly expense. A flat wick lamp consumed roughly 7/10 to 1 full fluid ounce per hour at typical settings. 5 hours per night, supper through bedtime, translated to approximately 150 hours per month. At 8/10 of a gallon consumed, that was 12 to 20 cents for a single lamp. 2 lamps for reading and sewing doubled the impact. Household consequences showed in the ledgers. Every additional hour of wick above minimum became a measurable fraction of a gallon. On an isolated claim, that translated directly into less cash for tools, grain, or spring freight. Farm journals and advice columns warned about burning up the barrel in winter. Diaries recorded the anxiety of watching the can level drop faster than expected. The unspoken household calculus ran constantly. Light now, or cloth later, light tonight, or seed in March. The family that could complete the same work with 2 gallons instead of 3 without buying new lamps effectively added dollars back into the winter ledger just by rearranging light. That rearrangement began not with the wick screw, but with understanding where the light was actually going. November 1880. Interior of a 16 by 20 foot claim shanty and a section house room at a small depot. The table stood under the roof's lowest tie beam. A dark ring marked the wood where a lamp chimney had cracked years before, spilling hot kerosene and burning a permanent scar into the plank surface. Typical 1 or 2 room interiors followed a common pattern. Central table, benches or simple chairs, maybe a side cupboard, low ceiling trapping smoke and heat. Surfaces either bare board, exposed log, or whitewashed plank where lime and effort had been available. Dark, smoke-stained wood absorbed light. Whitewash reflected it. The difference could be measured in how far across the room a person could still read newsprint, but most homesteads left walls bare because lime cost freight and labor. Devices in circulation varied by household means. Flat wick table lamps formed the backbone of rural lighting. Cheaper peg lamps and barn lanterns supplemented them. Better equipped houses, depots, and shops occasionally featured wall brackets with tin reflectors, but these represented investment beyond most claim budgets. Many homesteads owned only one good burner. Side lamps were cobbled together from cheaper hardware or reused bottles fitted with cork and tube assemblies. The result was a hierarchy of light. The main lamp stayed at the table. Lesser lights moved to stove, bedside, or barn as needed. Lamp hours became an implicit household metric. Museum collections and domestic manuals hint at rules like no more than one lamp after supper, or reading only while oil lasts. The cumulative hours a wick burned each night represented a concrete budget, tracked mentally if not on paper. Expectation suggested that more light meant buying another lamp or turning the wick higher. Reality showed families shuffling the same lamp among table, stove, and bed, compromising both light quality and safety. The lamp became a rationed asset, moved carefully and guarded when barrels ran low. With poor placement and dark walls, much of the kerosene's energy ended up heating ceilings and siding instead of illuminating tasks. Before anyone touched the wick screw, the geometry of the room had already decided how much of each gallon would actually reach a page or a needle. Early December 1880. Evenings in the same homestead and in a depot office where a telegrapher worked by a single lamp. The ledger pages lay pulled close to the chimney. The shadow of the pen crossed the figures as the writer leaned in, trying to keep numbers visible in the narrow cone of brightness. The physics of combustion lamps operated with brutal efficiency. Oil lamp engineering references documented that only about 0.25% of a kerosene lamp's energy became visible light. The rest became heat. That made where and how that tiny luminous fraction landed critically important. A low table lamp placed close to working hands threw hard shadows and created a bright hot spot at the table's center. Users instinctively leaned into this cone, increasing eye strain and narrowing the usable working area to a circle perhaps 18 inches across. Period complaints appeared regularly in newspapers and household guides. Advice columns warned about protecting the eyes. Doctors cautioned against reading by poor light. Some households restricted children from evening reading in winter to save both oil and eyesight. The shadow problem compounded with each object on the table. A book blocked light from reaching the edge. Hands casting shadows across work forced constant repositioning. The mending basket required moving closer to the flame. Ledger columns at the page edge became difficult to read unless the paper itself moved nearer the chimney. Glare added its own burden. The bright center of the flame created contrast so severe that pupils constricted, making the dim edges of the light field even darker. Workers developed headaches. Children complained. The evening hours that should have been productive became a struggle against the light itself. The assumption held that the only way to see better was more oil or more lamps. The engineering question asked whether, with fuel flow fixed, height, background, and direction of light could be adjusted to make more of that small luminous fraction useful. Poor distribution meant extra gallons burned just to overcome bad geometry. The moment someone treated lamp placement as an engineering problem instead of a habit, the kerosene bill became a variable, not a given. 1870s through 1880s. An Eastern hardware catalog desk, a railroad depot waiting room, a small-town hotel parlor. The bracket hung on the depot wall, its 7-inch curved tin reflector dulled by years of soot, but still directing light forward toward the benches where passengers read timetables and freight notices. Standard bracket lamps featured fixed or swing-arm wall mounts with shallow or deep tin or steel reflectors, typically 7 to 7½ inches in diameter and 10 to 11 inches tall. The design aimed to throw light forward into the room rather than letting it scatter in all directions. Depots and parlors used these fixtures where people needed to read notices, tickets, and schedules under time pressure. The elevated burner placed the flame above eye height. The curved, polished reflector sat behind the chimney. Sometimes a shade or hood reduced glare and prevented soot from blackening the ceiling. Performance evidence came from 19th and early 20th century lighting studies. Simple reflectors could increase useful forward intensity by 25 to 50% compared to a bare lamp at the same flame height. The improvement came not from burning more fuel, but from redirecting light that would otherwise strike the wall. The contrast between town and claim revealed the problem. Hardware catalogs offered these, fixtures where traffic and literacy demanded them, depots, hotels, shops. They seldom shipped all the way to isolated claims where freight cost per pound made every item a budget decision. The principle of redirecting and elevating light was proven in town fixtures. The frontier problem lay in translating it into something that could be built from a scrap kerosene can and a board. Catalogs showed prices. A commercial wall bracket with reflector cost 50 cents to $1.50 plus freight. For a homestead family counting pennies per gallon of fuel, that represented a month's kerosene budget invested in hardware instead of light itself. The physical solution to waste light was already bolted to depot walls. The question was whether someone could copy it using materials already on hand. January 1881. A claim-shanty a wagon day from the depot. A plain board stretched across two wall studs. Behind it hung a bright rectangle cut from a flattened kerosene can, its surface still showing faint letters from the barrel label. The assembly looked crude, but it worked. Materials came from what homesteads already had. Discarded or empty kerosene cans provided tinned sheet metal. Stovepipe offcuts added more material. Surplus boards from crate lumber or rough carpentry formed the shelf. Whitewashed walls reflected better than bare logs, but both could serve. Dimensions followed function. The shelf measured 20 to 30 inches long, 8 to 10 inches deep. Mounting height placed the lamp chimney center about 5 feet 6 inches to 6 feet above the floor, well above eyeline when seated. The backplate rose from a tin sheet 35 to 45 centimeters tall, slightly wider than the lamp base, gently curved or creased to spread light. A shallow metal visor extended 10 to 15 centimeters out over the front of the chimney. This hood limited upward glare and reduced ceiling soot, problems that plagued low table lamps. Build process required basic tools and modest skill. Cutting and flattening a kerosene can took an hour with tin snips and a mallet. Bending a shallow curve over a barrel or log created the reflector shape. Fastening tin to wall studs used cut nails or screws. The shelf itself attached with simple brackets or direct nailing into the studs. Neighbors sometimes mocked the contraption. A lamp belongs on the table carried the weight of tradition, but early users observed something immediate. The same flame, at the same wick height, appeared brighter on the far edge of the table and in the room's corners. Documentary evidence from later farm kitchen wall lamps showed that such forms eventually became common. The geometry matched depot hardware because the physics were identical. By lifting and backing the flame, the homemade bracket copied key commercial functions with scrap. Once the bright backplate was in place, turning the wick down became a rational choice instead of a sacrifice. Same homestead, February 1881. Evening tests at the work table. 2 chalk circles marked the table surface. The inner circle, 18 inches across, showed where pages had been readable, with the lamp sitting directly on the table. The outer circle, 3 feet across, marked the new readable area with the lamp on the shelf above. The geometry of illumination changed dramatically with elevation. A bare table lamp produced a steep, bright cone with rapid fall-off. Intensity dropped sharply beyond the immediate area around the base. Hand shadows cut dark wedges across the workspace. An elevated shelf lamp created a shallower cone with broader, more uniform illumination across 3 to 4 feet of table. The light arrived from above and slightly behind, reducing both shadows and glare. Effect on eyes and posture followed directly. A flame above eye level reduced glare. letting pupils adjust more uniformly across the visual field. Users could sit back rather than hunch directly over the chimney. This changed how long they could work or read before fatigue forced them to stop. The reflector multiplied the gain. Without a backing surface, a large fraction of the lamp's emission went backward and upward into the wall and ceiling, wasted energy that contributed nothing to the task at hand. With a curved tin backing, a significant portion of that backward light redirected forward and down into the room. Modern and historical photometry tests consistently showed 25 to 50% gains in forward intensity for simple reflectors compared to bare flames. The fuel flow stayed constant. The wick height remained unchanged, but the usable reading area on the table doubled or more. The shelf converted some of the lamp's waste light into task light without touching the burner or adding fuel. When a fixed gallon now illuminated twice as many square feet of work surface, the cheapest way to save oil wasn't moral restraint. It was carpentry. The same principle applied in depot waiting rooms and hotel parlors was now working in a claim-shanty built from scrap lumber and an empty kerosene can. March 1881. Homestead kitchen, depot office, and general store counter. A scrap of newspaper moved inch by inch across the table until the print blurred into gray. A pencil mark noted the distance. The test repeated with the lamp on the shelf, and a second mark recorded the new limit. Practical tests required no instruments. Reading fine newsprint at the table's far edge gave a reliable threshold. Threading a needle with dark thread under varying light provided another. Copying ledger columns at different distances from the lamp offered a third. Before and after comparisons used the same lamp at identical wick height, first on the table, then on the shelf with reflector and hood. The distances at which each test remained comfortably possible served as a proxy for actual illuminance levels. Results showed clear patterns. If reading remained easy, at 1 1/2 times the previous distance after the shelf installation, that implied roughly double the illuminance at the former limit. The math aligned with reflector physics documented in commercial lighting studies. Off-grid lighting research from later periods confirmed the scale of variation in kerosene consumption. Households using flat wick lamps consumed 10 to 15 liters per month per fixture, with large variations driven by placement, reflector use, and wick management. Users described the change as easier to see without quantifying it precisely. The documentary lens translated those perceptions into conservative percentage gains. A 25 to 50% improvement in usable light from the same fuel flow matched both physics and lived experience. Informal tests repeated across multiple households reinforced the pattern. The same lamp, burning the same oil, became measurably more useful when elevated and backed by a reflector. Without a single photometer on the prairie, families could still tell that the lamp shelf stretched each gallon farther than a bare lamp ever did. The method didn't require scientific instruments. It required only observation, comparison, and willingness to try something that looked odd but worked. Household accounts for winter 1880 through 81 compared with later winters after shelf adoption. 2 lines in a farm ledger told the story. The first winter showed kerosene 3 gallons per month in careful script. The following winter's entry read kerosene 2 gallons per month, lamp shelf fixed, with a notation in the margin. Baseline consumption scenarios were well documented in household accounts. 1 main lamp burning 5 hours per night. 1 secondary lamp running 2 hours for mending, kitchen work, or barn tasks. At roughly 1 fluid ounce per hour per lamp, cumulative burn reached 2 1/2 to 3 gallons per month in deep winter. Post-shelf adjustments showed immediate impact. With elevated, reflected light, the main lamp could run at a slightly lower wick setting while maintaining readable illumination. The secondary lamp often stayed unlit because the main lamp now covered more of the room. Recalculated usage dropped to roughly 7/10 to 8/10 of an ounce per hour for the main lamp. Secondary lamp hours were cut heavily. Monthly consumption fell to approximately 2 gallons, a reduction on the order of 1/3. Budget impact translated directly to household finances. At 15 to 25 cents per gallon, saving 1 gallon per month across a 3 to 4 month hard winter left roughly 45 cents to $1 unspent. That represented several days' wages in some contexts, or a tangible share of cloth or tool costs in the spring. The contrast revealed two paths to savings. Households without shelves achieved fuel reduction only by burning fewer hours, less reading, more dark evenings, tasks compressed or abandoned. Households with shelves maintained similar lamp hours but consumed less fuel per hour and needed fewer lamps overall. The difference wasn't virtue, it was design. Simple carpentry and tin work converted static practice into recurring savings with every storm-bound night. Over 10 winters, the scrap tin shelf quietly moved the equivalent of several dollars from the oil column into tools and grain, without a single extra barrel arriving by train. October 1880 through April 1881. Towns and homesteads along the Minnesota-Dakota rail corridors. Snowdrifts stood level with depot eaves. The tracks vanished into white beyond the platform. The logbook showed the last freight entry on the 20th of December. The next entry appeared on the 22nd of April. Storm chronology filled regional weather records. The first severe blizzard struck mid-October 1880. Repeated storms continued into early 1881. Drifts reached heights exceeding locomotive clearance. Entire sections of track disappeared under snow, packed solid by relentless wind. Rail blockages lasted weeks, then months. Documented accounts from local histories and meteorological reconstructions described attempts to clear the line. Crews with shovels made progress, then lost it to the next storm. Locomotives sent to punch through the drifts became stuck themselves. Logistics broke down completely. Coal, flour, and kerosene shipments sat stranded between division points. Some towns went months without resupply. The depots that served as distribution hubs for surrounding homesteads emptied their shelves and could not restock. Households relied entirely on whatever fuel already sat in their sheds. No quick replenishment was possible. Store ledgers documented the progression, dwindling kerosene stocks, rising prices as supplies tightened, and eventual none-available entries until the lines reopened. In average seasons, extra barrels could be hauled in midwinter when roads were passable. In 1880 through 81, no wagon could move beyond town limits. Snow depth and sustained cold made side hauling from distant depots marginal at best, then impossible. Whatever engineering efficiency households had built into their lighting systems was locked in when the rails stopped. There was no time to re-engineer under blizzard conditions. Decisions made in milder seasons, lamp placement, reflector installation, wick discipline, now showed their value line by line in how long the last gallon lasted. The hard winter made fuel efficiency not a thrift habit, but a survival constraint. Each design decision became visible in whether the lamp could still burn in March or went dark in February. January through March, 1881. Composite homestead scenarios across isolated townships. The lamp turned down a notch as children closed their books early. The wick hiss grew louder in the quiet room, then softer as the flame dropped. Another evening, compressed into fewer hours of light. Period accounts from the long winter era recorded the pattern. Families shortened lamp hours. Sewing moved to midday near windows when possible. Reading stopped earlier. Tasks that required fine vision were postponed or abandoned to save fuel. Strategy A relied on simple rationing, fewer lamp hours per night, more tasks compressed into daylight. The result was eye strain from working in marginal natural light, reduced capacity for evening bookkeeping and mending, and children's education curtailed. Strategy B combined rationing with design efficiency. Shelf and reflector systems installed before the winter locked in allowed wick settings to stay low while preserving task plane light. A single lamp-covered table and part of the room. Secondary lamps lit only for barn work or specific tasks. Quantified outcomes showed clear differences. For the same barrel in the shed, households with reflector shelves maintained closer to pre-winter evening routines. Households without design assistance had to cut service hours more sharply to avoid full depletion before rails cleared. Both groups showed frugality. Only one had prepaid for efficiency with carpentry and scrap tin done in milder weather. The contrast played out on adjacent sections under the same snowpack. One family ended March still using the main lamp each night, wick turned low but adequate with the elevated placement. The neighboring claim had been dark after supper for weeks, barrel nearly empty, choices exhausted. The difference wasn't virtue, it was geometry. Design decisions made in calmer seasons directly governed how much civilized time, reading, mending, accounts, a family could maintain when storms made town unreachable and supply impossible. On the frontier, survival margins often came down to such quiet engineering rather than dramatic action. 1880s through 1910s, hardware catalogs, farm kitchens, and surviving fixtures. The printed catalog page showed a kitchen wall lamp with reflector in careful engraving. The drawing depicted an elevated mount, curved metal backing, and partial hood. The geometry aligned nearly exactly with the scrap-built shelves that had appeared in claim shanties a generation earlier. Late 19th and early 20th century catalogs increasingly offered wall-mount reflectors, bracket lamps, and specialized kitchen lamps with integrated backplates and shades. Manufacturers standardized the form because demand proved it worked. The pattern repeated across product lines. Elevated mount placed the flame above eye height. Curved metal back redirected waste light into the room. Partial hood controlled glare and ceiling soot. These features aligned with depot fixtures and improvised shelves because they solved the same physical problems. The diffusion path traced from specialized applications to general use. Ships and depots adopted reflector brackets early for operational reasons. Passengers needed to read schedules, crews needed to see cargo manifests. The technology moved to parlors and hotels where paying customers expected better light. Eventually, the methods reached cataloged farm hardware as manufacturers recognized steady demand. Homesteaders who once used scrap tin adopted factory versions as incomes improved and rail links stabilized. Contrast between improvised and factory production showed in finish and adjustability. Scrap-built shelves had rough edges, variable curves, and fixed positions. Commercial brackets offered predictable geometry, painted or enameled finish, and sometimes adjustable swing arms. But the fundamental advantage remained identical. Fuel arithmetic drove adoption. Once enough people realized a reflector bracket squeezed more useful light from each gallon, paying freight for dedicated hardware became worthwhile. Catalog prices reflected this. A factory wall bracket with reflector cost 50 cents to $2 by the 1890s. For families who had proven the concept with homemade versions, that represented a reasonable upgrade. For new households, it offered tested technology without trial and error. By the time electricity arrived in many rural districts, the wall lamp bracket was as standard as the cook stove. The full shelf had become sound engineering, mass-produced, and shipped by rail to every depot in the territory. Present day. Workshop bench with modern LED task light and restored kerosene wall bracket. A lux meter sat on the bench. The digital readout showed measurements under a modern reflector task light, then under a lit wall bracket kerosene lamp in controlled comparison. The numbers told a story of continuity. Core principles restated themselves across the century gap. Combustion lamps remained intrinsically inefficient. Less than 1% of fuel energy became visible light. The rest became heat, always. Reflectors and shades created no light. They reassigned it. The curved metal surface behind a flame redirected photons that would otherwise strike a wall. The geometry was simple. The advantage was measurable. Modern lighting practice relied on the same logic at industrial scale. Desk lamps, workbench lights, and street lighting all used carefully shaped reflectors and diffusers to place lumens where they mattered. Standards in lighting design, task illuminance, glare control, uniformity, echoed the same goals pursued crudely with tin and boards on the frontier. The frontier builder had talked in terms of, "Can I see the stitch?" rather than lux or lumens. But the underlying physics remained identical. A photon redirected by a curved surface traveled the same path whether the source was a kerosene flame or an LED array. The engineering textbooks that now specified reflector curves, mounting heights, and task plane illuminance were formalizing knowledge that frontier households had developed through necessity and observation. The theory arrived later. The practice worked. First, replace the flame with an LED strip and the kerosene with a battery, and the geometry of the old shelf still functioned. The same distribution logic applied. The same savings accumulated, just measured on a different meter. The continuity from improvised tin backing to engineered reflector systems showed that small, practical innovations often preceded formal understanding. The frontier builders who elevated and backed their lamps had discovered principles that would later fill engineering handbooks, but they discovered them by watching where the light actually went. Present day. Archive reading room with 19th century farm ledger and modern analysis. A thin, ink-faded line recorded history in careful script. Kerosene, 2 gallons, lamp shelf mended, sat squeezed between entries for seed oats and shoe repair. The placement revealed priorities. Light mattered, but so did the method that made light affordable. Technical impact summarized clearly. Roughly 1/3 reduction in kerosene consumption for the same hours of useful light, once reflector shelves or brackets were adopted. Over a 3 to 4 month winter, 3 to 4 gallons saved. Over 10 winters, dozens of gallons unburned. Budget meaning translated to household finances with direct clarity. Kerosene retailing at 15 to 25 cents per gallon meant those savings equaled several dollars over a decade. Against farm cash incomes of the era, when lighting could consume a few percent of household expenditure, that margin mattered. The broader frame showed why small efficiencies accumulated into survival margins. Rail disruptions, crop failures, and medical bills could erase a year's financial progress. Converting scrap tin and an off-cut board into recurring fuel savings represented rational risk management, not perfectionism. Documented homestead accounts showed the pattern. Entries for lamp oil fell after certain improvements. Fewer notations about leak repairs or soot damage appeared. Occasional remarks about tight or dry houses suggested secondary benefits: less moisture, cleaner air, more stable indoor conditions. The symbolic convergence of ledger line and surviving wall bracket told the complete story. A small, replicable design change quietly altered how far a gallon of kerosene reached into the long winter evenings. No heroics, no invention from whole cloth. Just careful observation, practical adaptation, and the discipline to build something that looked odd but worked. In a winter remembered for drifts that stopped trains and cattle that never saw spring grass, the lantern shelf stands as a reminder that on the frontier, survival often depended less on dramatic action than on how carefully families aimed the light they already had. If you value fact-grounded frontier engineering and how small design choices, like the lantern shelf, changed real lives, consider subscribing or supporting the channel so more of these documented build stories can be reconstructed from the record and turned into working diagrams.